بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. So we come together after a long period of time of not meeting. One of the things that is important to emphasize is the transition that we have to make from the text to where understanding lies with regard to Sujud al-Sahw and the ruling for it. In the text of al-Akhdari, there's a position of Sujud al-Sahw being obligatory. And that's because there's a difference in the madhab with regard to how to conceptualize Sujud al-Sahw, meaning how to understand the role of Sujud al-Sahw. And the implications for that difference are two different rulings. So the implication results in two different rulings, implication of the difference of opinion internally in the school. And those differences don't just end in a diversity of what they say of type, but it's a diversity of actual, it appears to be an actual contradiction. And we talked about that a little bit. Put it in different words, Akhdari says is wajib, and the madhab, it says, أما حكم سجود السحو فمشهور مذهب مالك أنه سنة سواء أكان قبليا أو بدعيا، وهذا ما مشى عليه خليل في مختصره. وأما سجود البعد فلا خلاف في عدم وجوبه. So here الطحطاوي, he compiled his own book. Tahtawi is an interesting scholar because Tahtawi always presented himself, in my opinion, or at least how he appeared to be better said, as a mysterious figure, very quiet, not not someone that is widely known, but known because he put a lot of work into the madhab. Similar to Akhdari. Akhdari was known by a couple of books. And that's it. Like, and there's some scholars that are like that. Some scholars that the only thing you know about them is their work. The work itself proved to their knowledge. There's not much else that's known about them. But Tahtawi, he compiled this book. He did a lot of work in the madhab. He's from Egypt. And he did a lot of service to the madhab. Outside of that, it's not 100% clear for me who Tahtawi is. Uh, Outside of the work that he did in the madhab. But time and time again, throughout the years, his work has proven itself to be extremely beneficial. And he's pretty well grounded in the madhab. So he compiled the book on Sujud al-Sahw because Sujud al-Sahw, in reality, in the madhab of Malik, is extremely developed, as mentioned prior. or mentioned before. But as mentioned, when you study the Mukhtasar systems in madhab fiqh, you encounter problems. They're knowledge problems that have to be overcome. And specifically within the Mukhtasar system, within the school of Malik, is extremely complicated because you have a number of different books, and at times the positions in those texts clash with each other, so you don't have continuity. So that creates for the student conditions that necessitate learning how to read and learning how to work through those internal differences within the madhab. That was one of the propellants or one of the things, and I mentioned this before, I mentioned it again, that facilitated for the Salafi da'wah. Because for the Salafi da'wah, you had texts that were being produced, and I'm talking about the Arabic language. I'm not talking about what was happening in New Jersey or Philadelphia or the UK. I'm talking about what was going on overseas. You had the publication of texts, and they were very clear. Language was very clear, very accessible, and they were being written by scholars that are living. And there was a system where you're presented with the evidence for what it is that is being taught. And so it simplified the path for people. From an educational perspective, there was some benefit in that. Eventually, a lot of what we see, particularly in the Arabic speaking world, the madhahib ended up adjusting and kind of renewing themselves. And that's why the idea of the Salafi da'wah in that context has its own problems versus the idea of the Salafi da'wah in the context of the US. But also within the madhahib, you have scholars that do that work. Sometimes they're not acknowledged because of the idea of the way things are done. So you have people like Al-Abbi, Al-Maliki, who's extremely well grounded in the madhab, has nothing to do with the Salafi da'wah. And he goes and he explains the main books that the madhab is taught from stage A to Z. Right. And so you have this scholarly companion that's going through these books with you in terms of his commentaries and in terms of his critical additions that he's putting out, and so on and so forth. And so you have some consistency. And so that problem is overcome. Ibn Khaldun was the one that brought up the problem of the Mukhtasar system. I always say this. In the Muqaddimah, in his Muqaddimah, he talked about how it is, because in his Muqaddimah, his introduction to the study of history, he talks about different branches of knowledge. And it's worth a read in the English language. He talks about tasawwuf, he talks about fiqh, he talks about aqidah, he talks about hadith sciences, he talks about philosophy, he talks about mathematics, he talks about all different types of knowledge because he's going to study the rise and fall of civilization. And he talked about the difference between the Malikis in the West and the Malikis in the East, overseas, not necessarily East-West in the way that we understand it today. The Malikis of al-Maghrib which meant Al-Andalus and Morocco and so on and so forth, and then everything to the east. And he talked about how there was a difference in the educational systems. Qadi ibn Arabi brings this point up as well. He talks about how there was differences in the educational system, what was emphasized. Sometimes memory or memorization was emphasized over understanding. Sometimes understanding was emphasized first, then memorization. They had different techniques and systems. But Ibn Khaldun criticized the way that the Malikis dealt with the Mukhtasar system, which means basically he was criticizing the way that basic literacy in the madhab was transmitted. And there's a lot to be said in that regard, because in the madhab of Malik, if you find most in today's time are focusing on Khalil, and I mentioned that before. The Ghumari brothers themselves had a criticism of that. Despite all the issues that surround them, they too, like the Salafi Da'wah, they pushed for a breaking of the accepted ways among the scholars of the later time. And they began to trek the path of hadith research, right? And so the Umari brothers, you find that they attempted to contribute back to the study of the madhab, and is mentioned within that circle that they were reviving the way of the madhab of old. Because the madhab of Malik was not known as Ahl al-Rai, but it was known as Ahl al-Hadith in the early phase. Right? It was the predominant school, the people of Hadith. For the people of Hadith, Malik himself, initially, most of his work is known to us by way of the Muwatta. The Mudawwana is not the work of Malik. In the books that come after, that trace the work of Malik and so on and so forth. But Imam Shafi'i, rahmatullahi alayhi, he went to Iraq with the knowledge of Malik and the knowledge of others as well. But the Muwatta was central, even to the extent that Muhammad bin Abi Hassan al-Shaybani was one of the imams in the school of Ahl al-Rai that teamed up with Abu Hanifa, was also known as a student of Imam Abu Hanifa, but an imam in his own right as well. He transmits the Muwatta by way of his own chain of transmission. So the early imams focus on hadith, and the madhab of Malik, there was a heavy focus on hadith, and the later day scholars began to push the idea of restudy of hadith, and that's why you have sometimes this clash with how do we deal with madhabi based fiqh, because you have on the side of madhabi based fiqh, which is a collection of the opinions of the scholars, sometimes on issues that took place, sometimes on theoretical issues. You have this other body of knowledge, which is a more direct study of hadith. Doesn't mean that the fiqh is not based on hadith, but the fiqh is not just hadith. The fiqh is opinions of the scholars, like in the case of Sujud al-Sahw, you have differences of opinion. So coming back to the point that was mentioned, that in the madhab, the mashhur position is that Sujud al-Sahw is sunnah. And we were trying to make sense of that before, right? Uh, when we were reading. And so he says that regarding Sujud al-Sahw, what is the mashhur position of the madhab of Malik is that indeed it is sunnah, regardless of whether it's that sujood al-sahw that's performed before the salam or after the salam. And that is the position that is tracked by Imam Khalil in his Mukhtasar. On the other hand, sujood that is performed after the salam, there's no difference in the absence of obligation in that case, meaning that the sujood, the sahw performed after the salah, after the salam, which would be after the salah is finished, it is not obligatory. On the other hand, contrary to that, sujood, the sahw performed before the salam, Ibn Rushd, the grandfather, takes the opinion in his book, The Answers, and Ibn Rushd, the grandson, in Bidayat al-Mujtahid, along with Qadi Abdul Wahhab al-Maliki al-Iraqi, that it is an obligation with regard to the sujood that comes before the salam. And Qadi Abdul Wahhab, he said, الذي يقتضيه مذهبنا أن سجود السهو للنقصان واجب في الصلاة، لأن مالك اختلف قوله فيه. So Qadi Abdul Wahhab, who is not a normal scholar, the little that I know about Al-Qadi Abdul Wahhab, first of all, he's representative of the school of Iraq, the Maliki school in Iraq. And the Maliki school in Iraq is different than the Maliki school in Egypt. Most of what we're following in today's time is the Maliki school in Egypt. And the Maliki school in Egypt is not necessarily what we call the school of Dalil, is the school of Riwaya. Whereas the Maliki school in Al-Andalus is the school of Dalil. The Maliki school in Morocco, if you go back to Hafid Abdul Bar, similar concept. But they mix between the two approaches. And the Maliki school of Iraq, or the first is Maliki school of Medina, which is what we find with Imam Malik and the Muwatta and so on and so forth, that type of approach. Then Al-Andalus and Morocco and the other surrounding countries in that part of the world, that region. Then you have also the school of Egypt, and then you have the school also of Iraq. The school of Iraq, representative in the teachings of Al-Qadi Abdul Wahhab, is unique in its features, in that it interacted with the Hanafi school, which is similar to what you see in the school of Malik overall, but the difference is that is presenting the madhab along with the idea of ta'leel or the rationale behind the ruling, which is somewhat what you see in the Hanafi madhab, and the evidence. So when you go to the works of Al-Qadi Abdul Wahhab, kind of what the Salafi Da'wah was making the claim of we need to study with evidence. That was being done within that school of, or within that tendency within the madhab. The other issue is Al-Qadi, his writing is not normal because he's a Qadi. The Qadi, like in the case of Iyad, Al-Qadi Iyad, they have a different way of writing. They have a different way of writing because they're dealing with legal cases. They're not dealing with just theoretical teachings. My uh, preference in the study of fiqh throughout the years has been to incline to those scholars that were within the judiciary system, not just scholars that were teaching books. That's beneficial, but they have a different flair, a different way of dealing with things. You find that their orientation is reconciliatory between the different opinions. You find that they have a way of thinking about rulings and actions that builds the student's mind up. In today's time, within the Hanbali school, particularly Saudi Arabia, if you were to compare someone like Qadi Bassam and Sheikh Uthaymeen and others, Qadi Bassam is interesting in that regard because you see it and it comes out in his writings. He has an explanation of Bulugh al-Maram and some other books in Hanbali fiqh. But you see that reality. Just like those that study Sharia wa Qanun, those that study Sharia and they study the contemporary legal philosophy or system as well, they operate different than the person that just went through Islamic studies or just studied Sharia or by itself, because they have to deal with law. So the way they write is different. Like Dr. Abdul Karim Zaidan, in his book Al-Wajiz in Usul al-Fiqh, he's from the ulama of Iraq himself. He was contemporary scholar. You find that the way that he writes, he's dealing with legal realities. And those types of scholars that are aware of those things, their fatwa is different than the fatwa that comes from someone that's disconnected. And that's why some of the criticisms that were waged at Sheikh al-Albani of them is that كان صاحب فن, that he just focused on one area of knowledge, which is hadith. So some have criticized and say صاحب فنون أقوى من صاحب الفن, that a person that is grounded in multiple areas of knowledge is stronger than a person that is specialized just only in one area of knowledge. And the idea of specialization if you look at the case of Hafid bin Hajar went to hadith after he mastered multiple areas of knowledge. That's not to say, not to necessarily say Sheikh al-Albani didn't have grounding in other areas of knowledge. That's not a good approach to take that. But he became heavily focused on that with particular goals, and that shaped a whole school of thought and eventually shaped the Salafi Da'wah, and it eventually shaped the general public that went with that approach to just be focused on one area of knowledge. Even the issue of fiqh was very weak among them. And so that's something that you have to, consider how the educational structure works among different groups. What do they emphasize? And mostly in this case that we were talking about the issue of the judiciary and all that type of concept. Do they even deal with social realities and the needs of the people? Right. So that was the point of that. So Qadi Abdul Wahab, he says that, what's apparent and what is the position to be followed within our madhab is that Sujud al-Sahw, in the case of deficiency, that means before the salah, before the salam, uh, before the salam is recited, is an obligation. And the reason for that is that the statements that issue forth from Malik in this matter differ. So he says, فإن تركه حتى طال أو انقضى وضوء عاد الصلاة. And we mentioned this when we met last time, that if the sujood al-sahw is not performed to the point that there's an elongation of time or time passes, or the person's wudu is invalidated, then that person is to uh, renew the salah. May Allah allow us to establish the salah and remove all the obstacles. Then he moves on to say, this is Tahtawi, وكان الشيخ أبو بكر الأبهري. So Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Abhari يمتنع من إطلاق الوجوب. So Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Abhari, he abstained from using the term wajib. So that was his way out of that difference of opinion by not using that terminology. But then he would say, وَيَقُولُ إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تُعَدُّ بِتَرْكِهِ, that the salah is to be performed again in the case of sujood al-sahw not being performed. وعندي أن ذلك خلاف في عبارة لأن الغارض حاصل وهو فساد الصلاة بتركه وهذا فائدة الوجوب. Actually, all of that was Qadi Abdul Wahab speaking. To be more clear, I think I gave a different impression. All of that was a quote from Qadi Abdul Wahab, especially in the book, coming from the book Al-Ishraf. And here he states that he's of the opinion that there's different ways to talk about the issue in the madhab. But the point is recognized, the objective is reached, and that is that with the abandonment or with the non-performance of Sujud al-Sahw, the Salah is invalidated. And that, my friends, is the benefit of, he doesn't say my friends, but that is basically the benefit of what something being obligatory means, that if it's not performed, if something is obligatory and it's not performed, then that thing is invalidated. Any uh, questions in that regard?
No question, Chef. Everything is clear.
So I wanted to make sure that we were clear on that because so where we dropped off was in this section of the person that forgets the sujood al-sahw that's performed before the salah is out before the salam. And that was we covered a lot of that in this reading on the ruling. Uh, with regard to this piece, overall is sunnah, such as sahw sunnah, but then more specifically in this case, wherein there's a deficiency in the salah and the sajda sahw is not performed, then we have an issue. So the idea is that Sujud sahw for deficiency in the salah, it has to be performed. If it's not performed, then the salah is invalidated. And within the school, there's some differences of opinion, but the position that's conveyed here is a position conveyed from one of the opinions of Malik because of the variation in narrations. You find that in the school, those are the two opinions that is sunnah and is wajib, and then you get this technicality. Right. One of the things that I've found some scholars have said too, uh, more specifically, they have said, and I found in what it is that they have said. One of the deficiencies that we encounter within the study of the Maliki fiqh is not only that we're not reading the Muwatta, but also that we're not reading the Mudawwana. And not just that we're not reading the Muwatta Mudawwana, that we're not reading the explanations and the various transmissions of the Mudawwana. And in the past, maybe 15 years, there's been many books that were manuscript, handwritten. They were not published because they were handwritten. And they were not published in the typeset that put them into general circulation, meaning the books how we have them now, that they're sold from a bookstore. You could get them in PDF or that type of stuff. And so there's some scholars that have focused on accessing the Mudawwana, and there's a discussion which seems that is possibly rich. I haven't done enough research on this to talk at a very profound level. But in my library, I had purchased the text, and sometimes you find this among some of the Umeri brothers as well. There's this whole discussion about how some things that are transmitted in the Mudawwana as the position of Malik is not necessarily the case that that was his position. That's the type of argument that's made. And so some of the differences in the madhab, going back to that, if we're not clear on the explanations of the Mudawwana and the criticisms with regard to various narrations, then we're not going to understand at times why there's difference in the madhab. This example, such as the Sahw that we just covered, goes back to that. It goes back to that issue. So confidence is important. Muhammad Mukhtar Shanqiti, although he was explaining a Hanbali fiqh book, Zad al-Mustaqna, he did an excellent job, by the way. But he comes from the Shanatiqa, or he comes from Mauritania, and he was grounded in the Maliki madhab earlier on. And one of the things that he said that was very important in teaching is that the student has to have confidence in what it is that he's studying. And I know that from personal experience. When you don't have confidence in what you're studying, you're semi-doubtful of it. Confidence is different than just blind ignorance. Confidence is because sometimes what you're reading is wrong and you have to be able to critique it at a certain point of knowledge. But confidence is where there's some degree of trust. It's possible for there to be a mistake. It may not be the scholar, it may be the printing press. Maybe that there was something off when they printed the book. Scholars point maybe the way that it is, or maybe scholar misread something. So you're trusting the person, but they may have misunderstood, misread. all of that type of thing. But that doesn't necessarily undermine overall the confidence. Uh, but it shows that you're aware there's human mistake. When you lack confidence, as we said before getting to that point, having confidence doesn't mean blindly following to the extent that you don't know what's going on, to the extent where you can't be corrected, to the extent where you can't update your understanding. So it's not appropriate to always say that taqlid is blindly following. In some cases, taqlid is actually ittiba', but it's not talked about, which means to follow with understanding. Like in this case, when we're going through the fiqh book and we're stopping and we're saying, okay, well, there's a difference in the madhab, okay, and we're coming to the point of understanding why it is that there's a difference in the madhab. At that point, that's not necessarily taqlid totally, because there's ta'leel with us to some extent. Ta'leel meaning that we understand the rationale. It's easy for us to go, we can get the ahadith behind or behind this fiqh or the ahadith that deal with such the sahw. But then we talk about the understanding of the salaf, some people. So what do you do in that case where there's multiple opinions coming from the salaf? Because Malik was from the salaf. So that's where we have multiple narrations. We may take one over the other in terms of their understanding. Same thing with Ahmed, same thing with Abi Hanifa, same thing with Shafi'i, or any other Imam from the earlier generations that may not be popular. That's why the idea of the four madhabs has its benefit, but its limitations. But the point being is that confidence in scholarship and respect and regard doesn't always mean blindly following without understanding. It means that there's a discipline there, there's a starting point there. So just like people say they want to understand, that's the same thing that those that do taqlid in the healthy way, because there's good taqlid, there's bad taqlid. But good taqlid is where you have confidence in what the scholar is saying or the process, but you're open as well and you're pushing towards understanding. You have to start somewhere. At first, you may not know. It's just like the GPS. You're going into an environment that you don't know. You have a certain level of confidence that the GPS is going to get you there, although the GPS can be incorrect at times. Same thing with the madhab. It's a GPS for those that don't know. But that's why it's important the way that the idea of madhabi fiqh is presented. Not it shouldn't be presented in such a way that as a counter at this point to this group or that group, because internally, for instance, within the Salafi Dawah, there is the teaching of madhab. This has always been the case. maybe in one school of thought or trend within the Salafi Dawah, they had a different approach, but as well, those people were involved in studying, like the tendency of Sheikh al-Albani. Those people were involved in studying. It's not like the brother in the masjid that picks up Sahih Bukhari in a translation, or he's going to the internet and pulling off opinions, two different realities. But confidence is important. Confidence in the book, confidence in the process. It doesn't mean that you're blindly following. It means that you're giving the process a chance. You're trusting, but it's not necessarily a blind trust, because you could study something else and have another understanding, but you're not there disrupting, the process, so to speak. You're there trying to work through the process. So that's important, right? That's an important reality to think about. So we were on that position. We covered that there's a difference of opinion between the scholars on the issue of the Sujud al-Sahw before and after within the madhab. Uh, Sujud al-Sahw before the salam is considered to be to cover the deficiency, right? And so that is considered to be an obligation. And that brings us to Sujud al-Sahw after the salam. ومن ناسي sujud ba'di, or after the salam. Whoever forgets the prostration, this is where we're at. Whoever forgets the prostration for forgetfulness that comes after the salam must do it, even if it's after a year. But here, must do them, it's a high recommendation, because this لا يترتب على هذا شيء. Like, in the sense that if you forget it, your salah is not invalid, right? Your salah is not invalid. So fa'idatul wujub, the benefit, or what distinguishes wujub as a ruling, wajib, what distinguishes the obligation from the non-obligation is the non-performance of the obligation invalidates the action. That's not the case in sujud al-sahw that's forgotten after the salam. Here we enter a different realm. من نقص here. من نقص فريضة فلا يجزيه السجود عنها، ومن نقص الفضائل فلا سجود عليه. We covered that many times. And that is what is Sujud al-Sahw aiming at correcting. And Sujud al-Sahw is not of the level of strength to be able to cover a deficiency in the salah in the case of forgetting an obligation, right? I personally feel, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I personally feel that the way the topic is covered, aside from how we're reading it, but just how it's covered in the books, is that it has to be restructured, because there's confusion in the way that it's presented. Firstly, on the issue of the idea of Sujud al-Sahw overall, its ruling, that in itself, it can be confusing. The other issue is Sujud al-Sahw in the case of the Fard and the Fada'il and these types of things. That should be in its own, like, before getting into all these details, the way that we find it in the text, just the ruling of Sujud al-Sahw by itself, there should be a conversation about that. There should be a conversation about how it is that Sujud al-Sahw complements the Fard when you make an error in the Salah and forget to perform an obligatory action. How Sujud al-Sahw complements your performance of that Fard as making up the deficiency. Say, for instance, you realize you forgot a rak'ah, and then you perform the rak'ah upon being conscious within the time where and you're still within the salah. You just don't perform the fard and that's it. You perform the fard and you perform sujood al-sahw because that sujood al-sahw is the way that you safeguard the good that you did. Just because there's a deficiency in the good that you did doesn't mean that you can't address that deficiency in the case of the salah. Even overall, as an idea, is a beautiful concept that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala regards your deeds. Even if there's some deficiency in them, you get the opportunity to correct them. So in the case of salah. So, but that's not presented like that. You know what I'm saying? And so that leads to some misunderstanding among many people. The other issue is this, for instance, in this point, because now the topic is what does sujood al-sahw uh, cover, or what does sujood al-sahw, what realm does it function in, right? What is the place of sujood al-sahw? How does sujood al-sahw restore the salah, right? As for he who has omitted an obligatory part of the prayer, the prostration for forgetfulness cannot compensate for it. The obligatory action which he has omitted from the prayer is what is being talked about. As for he who omits the meritorious or the fada'il, there's no sujood al-sahw there. Because sujood al-sahw is in the case of the sunan, even in that issue. The separation between the sunnah al-khafifa and the sunnah al-mu'akkidah. The separation between the sunnah that is mu'akkidah and the sunnah that is not. That also is not, like, that's not mentioned in al-Akhdari directly. It's mentioned indirectly here. And where is it at? Does it come up? It comes up here. As for one sunnah action, there's no sujood required in what? In the case of his non-performance. Unless the error involves praying with a silent voice when it should be loud, or praying in a loud voice when it should be silent. Why? Because that's from the muakkadat. But in al-Akhdari, that discussion doesn't take place in the obvious way. Part of that is possibly part of why that is noted, or part of why that is talked about in that way, is because this book is facilitating for kids. Just like Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, there's certain things that are presented and so on and so forth, and other things left out because it's a book for kids. And just like this book was written with a particular purpose in mind, it doesn't mean that we can't reorient the way that we're teaching. We can use the same knowledge, but we can reorient the way that we're teaching. And this is where a lot of the discussion needs to take place. Because like the whole idea of following a madhab has become a branding issue more than it is a knowledge issue for some people. It becomes a way to legitimize their institute. It becomes a way to legitimize themselves before the people. You know what I'm saying? And so that a lot of times it's not like I was at a conference, and I was listening to somebody talk about teaching, in this case, Hanbali fiqh, and how we have to study traditionally and how we have to study the madhab and this, that. And I was like, no, you're into that not because of the knowledge technique. You're promoting that because you have an institute that this is the way that you're teaching. Because traditionally, we weren't charging for knowledge. So you don't talk about that angle of the traditional side. You know what I'm saying? You only talk about the angle of the ijaza and this and that for legitimacy's sake. But if we're going to talk about the whole kit and caboodle, then we're going to talk about the whole process of education from every angle, even from the angle that the students receive the stipend. Yeah, necessity in today's time requires sometimes that people pay for education, but that's not it. We're not having a complete discussion on the study of the madhab. That's my issue. Because when you look at places like al-Azhar, whether in Egypt or what was Syria and this, that, the scholars are not scared to take these older books and rearrange them so that they're more clear. So that the student that is not going to spend 15, 20 years studying the madhab, like was the case in the past, has the ability to access the madhab in a way that's beneficial. And there's a lot of books that have been generated, composed, written in that regard of presenting the madhab in a more clear way. That's why I keep saying, like, when people say, oh, you have to follow madhab, don't follow madhab, because there's so many techniques now in education, right? And you have to know how to present the madhab. Like in today's time, in the study of the madhab, in many places, some people, like the one brother was talking about trying to bash the university system to talk about the halakha system. Well, the halakha system has its own problems too. And the halakha system, you're not doing a research paper for the most part. They just introduced research papers to Al Azhar at the lower level in recent times. So these are, we're having debates about educational methodologies and approaches. without even knowing that's what we're talking about in some cases. So here, Akhdari is not presenting clearly that there's a differentiation made between the mu'akkidat and other than the mu'akkidat. So then you get like in this case, that there's no sujood sahw except for the non-performance of three or more sunan. With that statement, there's an equalization, or there is a making of all of the sunan at the same level. It requires us to go to other books to know that all of the sunan are not at the same level, right? And when he makes the exception here at this point, he says that as for one sunnah action, no sujood is required unless the error involves praying with a silent voice. That shift from here to here, it doesn't make sense 100% unless you have this clarity that the sunan are operating at multiple levels. They shift from here to here, where it says unless. That the sunan are operating at different degrees. So some sunan have more strength than others with regard to the emphasis that's placed on them. All of the all of the sunnah is important. That's another This is another issue that we confront with the contemporary dawah scene. That the classification of actions into sunnah and wajib and this and that, it has its reasons and its rationale. It's not an attack on the sunnah. We know that it came later day. It wasn't used 100% in the way that is used by the later day scholars in the early generations. And we know, for instance, that's one of the things that within the context of Sheikh al-Albani's teachings, that's one of the things that he non-emphasized, the division between this and that, into being sunnah and not sunnah, and this in the effort to revive hadith, but it created confusion for a lot of people. And it created confusion for a lot of people because the student of knowledge, in many cases, that claimed to be studying these things didn't know what he was talking about. So when we talk about sunnah here, we are not belittling the sunnah, that's one. And second, there's an implicit acknowledgement that there's levels, there's degrees to the practice that comes under the category of sunnah. It's not all at the same level. And part of that fiqh or that understanding is so that we can judge the salah to be sound or unsound. So that we're able to talk with knowledge in the case where this particular action is left out. What do we do? And the only two madhabs that tried to combine between the issue of deficiency and addition in the salah is the madhab of Malik and the madhab of Ahmed. That doesn't mean that the madhab of Shafi and the madhab of Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhim jami'an, is, it's to be spoken of negatively, but you encounter a real problem in knowledge, and that is that sometimes the Prophet did one thing, alayhi salatu wasalam, sometimes he did another thing. You have to make sense of that. The other thing that you encounter is that not everything is spoken of. That's where the madhab is the madhab. The madhab is dealing with issues that are not spoken of clearly. Ijtihadat, matters that require research, matters that require thinking. The madhab concept has nothing to do with what is clear, what is ijma', for the most part. That doesn't mean that it doesn't deal with those issues. What I mean is that that's not the main focus of the madhab. It takes into consideration those things which are clear, those things which are matters of consensus and so on and so forth. But the madhab deals with issues where there's questions. That's why we say mas'ala. Mas'ala has a lot to do with the su'al, it has to do with what's asked. So I come and I say, okay, I forgot. I was in a rush. I didn't pray. I didn't pray 3 sunnah, or I didn't pray these actions. I didn't perform them in my salah. Is my salah valid? So then that's where that type of classification comes in that is beneficial. Well, these acts are obligatory in the salah. These acts are sunnah in the salah. These acts are fadail in the salah. Hold on to see, let's judge with knowledge. Is there some flexibility here or not? So as for one sunnah action, no sujood is required unless the error involves praying with a silent voice when it should be loud, or praying in a loud voice when it should be silent. And so he who prays silently in the prayer that should be prayed aloud should perform the prostration for forgetfulness. Why? Because he missed out on one of the sunnah muakkada before as-salam. So here when it says ولا يكون سجود القبل إلا لترك سنتين فأكثر. And some say that this is another issue, right? So in here, going back to this point, that there's no sujood sahw unless uh, two or more two or more sunnah are forgotten in the salah, right? Those are from the khafifa. Here, in the case of one sunnah being missed, it requires sujud sahw. That's from the sunan al muakkadat. And then here, in the case of the issue of forgetfulness, whoever forgets, here it says, whoever forgets the two prostrations for forgetfulness that come before the salam, until after he has already said assalamu alaikum, should perform the prostration for forgetfulness. If the time he remembers it soon after. If a long time passes before he remembers the two prostrations for forgetfulness, or he has left the masjid, the prostration for forgetfulness will become invalid, and the prayer for which the two prostrations for forgetfulness is required will become nullified or invalid. If what has been unintentionally omitted or forgotten in the prayer consists of 3 sunnah actions. So we have here, if you miss 3 sunnah, we have here if you miss 2 sunnah, here if you miss 1 sunnah. These are three different issues. Here, if you miss three sunnah, it's coming under the issue of forgetfulness. Here, if you miss two sunnah, it's coming under the issue of the light sunnah, forgetting the light sunnah. The issue of forgetfulness here, how does it separate from this issue here? Is basically you forgot and you already performed the salah. You salamed out. What do you do? Here, you remember in the salah before salaming out in these two cases. That's what separates the issue. That's why we say that fiqh, especially this type of fiqh that we're studying now, is scenario based. The scenario, you have to have an understanding of it. You have to conceptualize it. And then that's how you come to the ruling, and that's how you're able to differentiate one set of rulings from another set of rulings, because you're dealing with different scenarios. And so we'll stop there. Any questions?
No, but Jazakallah khair. Sheikh Yusuf, sorry I was late.
No problem. Hanif, are you still with us? So what comes now after so the new issue that comes up is من تكلم ساهيا سجد بعد السلام. So the new issue that comes up, today's date is the 8th, 2/8/26. Okay. I see your text, Hanif. So the new issue for next week is the person that speaks absent-mindedly in the salah should perform the prostration for forgetfulness after the salam. And remember that we covered the whole idea of the salah being broken up into words and actions. And other than words and actions, well, here, this section is dealing with words, right? Whoever says something, right, they add it now to the words. And more specifically, they did so unmindfully. It's different than intentionally doing it.